afternoon or good evening, of course, depending on which corner of the world you are connecting from. Thank you very much for participating in this event of the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. And you know, the Alliance has many partners, as you can see from the slide that is now on the screen. The UN Alliance is also not new to the high-level political forum. In the past, we were participating in person. This year, we will only participate virtually, as in most meetings. However, this doesn't mean we are less involved and we will have less contributors. On the contrary, we were very lucky to have a panel of very high-level speakers. Now, before we get into the core of the hard talk, I would like to give the floor, or better the screen, to the Director Generals of UNOG, Ms. Tatiana Volovaya. Ms. Volovaya doesn't need an introduction, especially for those in Geneva, know her very well in all UN-related events. But I would like also to stress that the Director General is in a way also the ambassador of the UN Alliance and has taken a serious interest in this topic over the years. And for your information, as I'm afraid she will not say it, so I want to say last year she was awarded the North Star Green Carpet Award for the work of the United Nations, in particular of the Alliance, to promote sustainable fashion and actually elevate his work. So welcome, Director General, and thank you for your support to our work, and the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's really a pleasure to be with you again today. And you're right about the award last year, but it was not my personal award. It was exactly the award for the United Nations. And I think that's really important that we work together, and you can always count on support for the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. And I think you are bringing today a really very important panelist and a very important topic. But I would like to start with a rather gloomy fact. As colorful as fashion can be currently, it is part still of the gray economy. The fashion industry is responsible for one of the most glaring environmental and social failures of our current economic system. And we have to admit this fact. And there is no way for us to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals without a paradigm shift in the way we produce, consume, and dispose of fashion items. The fashion industry is among the largest sectors in the world. Yearly, it generates $2.5 trillion in revenue. And millions of people are employed in this sector, and almost every individual, all of us, are direct customers of the fashion industry. Yet, already before the pandemic, the industry was under scrutiny for its unsustainable fast fashion business model and poor sustainability performance. And for me, today, amidst the pandemic, it's a very important issue because as a result of the pandemic, we see paradigm shift. We see that people are changing their habits. And it's exactly the high time when we can replace fast fashion with a slow fashion, with a more sustainable fashion. And of course, that would allow us to change the current situation when the sector is still lagging behind in striking number of social and environmental indicators. We still can say that dire working conditions and precarious social protection for millions of workers predominate across the entire supply chain, in cotton fields, mills, factories, warehouses, in transport and logistics, shops and stores, offices of brands and buyers, and on digital platforms. Women account for almost 80% of the workers in the fashion supply chain, and they are often at the bottom tier of textile production systems. And they bear the brunt of the social economic risks. And we saw that absolutely clearly during the pandemic. And when we look at the ecological dimension, the picture is not better. Every second, the equivalent of a garbage truck of textiles is burned or landfilled. Around 20% of the world's wastewater is produced by the fashion industry. Just think about the figure, 20%. It is also a key emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, with an estimated 8% of the world's emissions. That is more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. It is evident the trajectory of fashion collides with globally agreed sustainable development targets. Our world is witnessing a triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution, resulting in the deteriorating health and well-being of future generations. It is of the utmost importance to take fashion seriously. We are now in a unique position to rethink the industry and shift the needle to build back better and make fashion more sustainable and circular. This shift requires systematic changes and coordinated action by all stakeholders around the world. The vision for the future of the fashion industry is one where environmental sustainability and carbon neutrality is achieved, where people are guaranteed social protection and adequate working conditions, where millions of women and men are working in dignity, security, and with equal opportunities. This transformation can only be achieved through clear regulations and policies underpinned by credible systems and individual value shift. The United Nations stands ready to support this change, and the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion is accelerating the transformation in a coordinated manner by gathering those UN entities that engage with the fashion industry to speak in one UN voice in fashion. In 2020, the United Nations and the Alliance were awarded with a North Star Green Carpet Fashion Award for their commitment to promoting sustainable fashion. Last year, the Alliance has also completed the colossal task of mapping all initiatives, projects, and programs connected with fashion in the United Nations. The result, I would say, is impressive. Over 70 UN initiatives address the sector's various impacts on biodiversity, decarbonization, human rights, and occupational health and security. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we have less than 10 years left to achieve 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. All sustainable development goals, directly or indirectly, relate to the fashion and textile industry. When we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic, many of us will crave glitz and glamour, and the fashion industry, of course, can provide that. The sector will again see a spike in sales, but will the industry become more or less sustainable than it was before? That is the crucial question. But there is also the possibility to become more sustainable as a result of the pandemic. And I am absolutely sure that today's event offers a platform to address different questions we need to face in order to make fashion an authentic driver of 2030 Agenda. Today, we will hear views from private sector, advocacy groups, producers, as well as UN system. The speakers will help us understand how to turn fashion into a driver for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Let me end on a positive note. We know that fashion can be about responsible production and about responsible consumption. It can be about gender equality, poverty alleviated, well-being and decent work. It can be about innovation, regeneration of the ecosystem and partnerships. It is our common task to ensure that this vision becomes a reality. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Director General, for this substantive speech. As usual, another substantive speech from you on sustainable fashion. While you were talking, there were already comments in the chat commenting about the relevance of your speech, which really provides the background for our hard talk. So thank you very much again. I hope you'll be staying a little bit to listen in, and for sure this will not be the last event with us, so we can already liaise for the next one. Thank you again. So now let's enter in the core of our event, the hard talk. Why did we decide to call it the hard talk? Because we want to talk about sustainable fashion in a very serious way, not in a simplistic way, as we always often listen to. And we are driven by serious attempts and not greenwashing attempts to move towards a sustainable industry. Very often we hear that, okay, just by rearranging our wardrobe or buy more quality that we will fix the old problem. No, these are important actions, but it's a very complex issue. And now it's really time for the truth, as things might be really more complicated than what we have the feeling that they are. I don't expect also that we will all agree. We all have our opinions when it comes to sustainable fashion. We work in different sectors, we have different perspectives, but you may feel free to disagree. This is a hard talk. We don't need to negotiate here. We don't need to reach an agreement. We want to hear your views and we want to have an open discussion. Rule of engagement for the speakers now is that I will give you for each question 1 or 2 minutes, no more. And I will tell you for each question how much you have and to whom the question is addressed. I'm sorry, we have little time, so please be focused, to the point, and make sure you tell us give us a message you want to pass. I will take the liberty to interrupt you in case you're taking too long. I will not be the only one then asking questions. We will have time for a question and answer session of this event. So we will receive questions in the chat. Please send them as you deem it necessary, and then we will select some, if not all, depending on the time. So before we move on to the questions, I have the honor to introduce this panel. It's really a high-level panel. I'll try to do it quickly, but it's so much to say about all of you. I'll start with Simone. As Simone Cipriani is the chairperson of the EU Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, but is also the head and founder of the Ethical Fashion Initiative. EFI enables artisans who live in marginalized conditions in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia to become regular suppliers of international fashion and lifestyle brands, thus reducing poverty and empowering large numbers of women artisans. He has a career, of course, in the fashion sector and in leather industry, and managed also a series of industrial cooperation projects in the past. So welcome, Simone. Also, then another speaker in the panel today is Mr. Oliver Young, is the head of the Public and Private Services Unit of the Sectoral Policies Department of the International Labour Organizations, ILO, in Geneva. Oliver leads a team dealing with working conditions of service workers, including retail and commerce workers. So very much appropriate for today's event. Together with UNESCO, he coordinates the Secretariat of the Joint ILO-UNESCO Committee of Experts on the status of teaching personnel and promotes standards on education and teachers. He also works on labor issues related to the health, culture, sports sectors, as well as sustainable consumption. Next in the panel is Mr. Abhishek Bansal, and apologies if I don't pronounce your name correctly. I will come back to this and you will tell me. Head of Sustainability of Arvind Limited. Arvind Limited is a textile manufacturer with headquarters in India and is India's largest denim manufacturer. It has also recently ventured into technical textiles when it started the Advanced Materials Division in 2011. Abhishek is leading various sustainability initiatives of the group companies, currently on the board of directors of the Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals Foundation and Sustainable Apparel Coalition. And he has worked in the sustainability environmental consulting domain for more than 10 years. So welcome. And let's move on to Miss Ursula de Castro, founder of Fashion Revolution. I'm sure that those that are sustainable fashionista have heard of Ursula before. I have. Ursula is an international recognized opinion leader in sustainable fashion, and in 2006, she co-founded the British Fashion Council initiative Aesthetica at London Fashion Week. In 2013, she founded Fashion Revolution, a global campaign with participation of over 90 countries around the world. Ursula is a regular keynote speaker and mentor, is a lecturer, and as well a fellow at the Central St. Martin's Central St. Martin's University. Ursula's first book, and I'm pretty sure many of you know the book, is Loved Closed Last. And welcome, Ursula. And last in the panel, last but certainly not least, is Miguel Fluxa, the CEO of Camper. Well, we all know Camper, but just to say a few words, Camper was founded in 1975 by Lorenzo Fluxa. Its origins go back to 1877, when his grandfather Antonio sets in Inca in Mallorca the first machinery for shoemaking in Spain. So a long history of fashion in the family. Miguel has the fourth generation of the family, joined the company in 2003. Until December 2011, he was responsible for identifying and evolving the company's brand strategy, including the development of innovations, collaborations in the field of communication, product, and interior design. In January 2012, Miguel took over as CEO. So welcome to everybody in this panel, and we are right on time. I'm now moving on to the difficult part of the hard talk, and start with the first question that I'm gonna ask to everybody, and let's follow the sequence that we have now followed for the presentations. You have 30 seconds only for these questions. And my question is, what does sustainable mean when we talk about fashion to you? Simone, 30 seconds to you.
It's fashion that accepts to be part of a wider set of systems we call the planet and society, and therefore that assumes its responsibility towards them by carefully assessing and managing sustainability risks in the same way it assesses and manages economic and financial risks.
Thank you, Simone. Oliver, what does sustainable mean when we talk about fashion to you?
For me, it means 5 things. It's got to have least impact on the environment. It has to be made under decent work conditions. It has to look good. It has to be accessible so that it's not just something for elites. And it has to be economically viable so that businesses can actually flourish producing it. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. Abhishek, over to you.
Thanks, Paula. For me, sustainable fashion in short means doing no or less or least environmental harm and creating a positive social impact. And also looking at all parts of the value chain and not just one part. So right from material extraction to production to distribution, retail and end of life or use phase, we should consider everything. Thanks.
Thank you, Abhishek. Ursula.
So for me, it's the fashion revolution theory of change, a fashion industry that conserves and restores the environment and that values people over profit and growth.
Thank you. And Miguel, over to you. What does sustainable mean to you when we talk about fashion?
Thank you. I think for us, for me, sustainability means responsibility. I think that's the most important thing, and obviously means thinking long term. And when you put these two things together, obviously means thinking about long term and responsibility with everything and all the environment that you are surrounded. So I would say that's the most important thing for us.
Thank you very much, Miguel. And I have to say this question was hard, but more or less I would say that you are all in tune and going in the same direction. My next question is for Oliver and Ursula. So we start with Oliver and then Ursula, we pass it over to you. Millions of people depend on the fashion industry for their livelihood, and we know fast fashion is a big employer. How can we drive this industry to become more sustainable and consumers to be more mindful with their purchases without driving workers to unemployment? Oliver.
Well, thank you. I think it's a very important question, and the honest answer is we can't completely avoid job destruction. Any important shift in an industry since the agricultural revolution has resulted in some sort of job loss, but also job creation and a shift of roles of kinds of jobs. So I think countries that are facing a change in the fashion industry will have to massively invest in skills investment and skills upgrading to shift their industries toward a more sustainable model, but also anticipate perhaps branching into other industries. A lot of the countries that have had intense startup with textile manufacturing now have industrial experience that they can shift perhaps toward other industries. And that would mean looking at trade policy, industrial policies to make sure that there are identifiable other diverse products that can be produced. It means investing in social protection so that during this transition, workers don't lose income, workers are protected and don't fall into poverty. It means perhaps developing internal markets for garment and fashion production, which are currently just destined for abroad. And it also means, at least in developed countries, heavily investing in the jobs that might come out of e-commerce, repair, and recycling, or even, and we'll get into this later, some of the cultural work that can go around slow fashion and sustainable fashion. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. And I forgot to say you had 2 minutes each, but you were absolutely within the time limit. Ursula, I pass it on to you. Yeah, Ursula, you're muted.
Always. We need to switch speed for skills. Right now, garment workers, as well as being underpaid and overexploited, are also producing an inefficient and downright bonkers amount of clothing, which doesn't actually allow them to develop the skills to make things properly. We need to see a fashion industry that pays all their supply chain workers a dignified living wage. We need to see products that are made in dignity wherever it is that they are made. And we need to imagine that the lives of those supply chain workers will benefit. So we overall need to think of individuals that are better paid, products that are better made, and a very different narrative when it comes to fast fashion. Right now, we say fast fashion is so badly made, we might as well throw it away. That's disrespectful to the people who make it. It's disrespectful to those who cannot afford to buy any better. And it's showing how profoundly inefficient this industry is, both for people and nature.
Thank you very much, Ursula. And just a comment that I would not summarize your answers here or make any comments. We will have a special guest at the end of the Q&A that will have this responsibility. So we will hear from her what she has gathered from all your answers and all these questions and from the ensuing discussions. Let me now move to another hard question, which I'm asking to Miguel and Oliver, again, 2 minutes each. And here I go with a question. In light of these disruptions caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, including the consequences of widespread retail closures, layoffs, and furloughs, mandatory factory shutdowns, and canceled orders, which transformations are now necessary in order not to go back to the old system of exploitation and overproduction? Over to you, Miguel.
I think, unfortunately, I'm not too optimistic with the pandemic in terms of the change, because I think memory is quite short. So I think we will go back to the bad habits soon. And I think obviously some things have changed, and I think that's good. I think people are more aware of the risk of the environment that poses into our future, and I think a lot of things have to change. But for us, as I was saying, I think that the most important thing is going back to basics, or going back to the old, maybe to the old system, which is, okay, can we make things that last? Can we make things which are long lasting and we not just throw them away? as we were saying, in a way that it's achievable for everybody, and it's because obviously this is not giving lessons to anyone, but because we are all imperfect, we pollute. I think we have to be aware of that, and we make our mistakes. But for sure, I think without quality and without thinking about long-term repairing a lot of these things, I think it's very difficult that we solve this issue. And I think it's probably one of the pillars. Then of course there are a lot of things which are behind. And I think that this is we're seeing more innovation and more products which are made from recycling. I think that this is great, but we have to question our model of consumption. And as Oliver was saying before, I think that's difficult, of course, because there are a lot of jobs and a lot of people that buy fast fashion. I think that's fair. So how do we do that in a responsible way? Because I think that's also part of the responsibility.
Thank you, Miguel. I hope that we will not go back to the old ways, and hopefully the pandemic has accelerated a bit the shift that was already ongoing, but only time will tell, and we might be coming back in a few years with another event and check back. Oliver, what do you think about this?
Well, thanks, and I agree with a lot what Miguel said. Yes, of course, and I think this comes up in a later question. We need a cultural shift. It needs to go away from a business model that really predicates on mass production and a very rapid cycle of consumption to something that is perhaps slower production and a slower model of consumption, but at a higher price to compensate for environment, but also decent work deficits. I think that's possible. We've seen other sectors where this has changed. I'm just thinking of the slow food movement in Italy, or the craft beer movement in the United States and in Europe, where people suddenly are paying double what they paid for before, consuming less, and actually creating a lot more jobs going to, let's say, local breweries. And what's interesting about that model is that not only have these breweries produced sort of better quality and artisanal beer, but they've also expanded cultural things. They've included restaurants and concerts with their concept. Wouldn't something like that be possible in the fashion industry, where smaller fashion producers producing less, producing higher quality, can take over parts of the market and perhaps market them in a different way? And I think COVID has perhaps opened doors for this through the expansion of e-commerce. So I think that's a long-term shift. In the short term, I would just add, yes, we need to address urgently the decent work deficits in a lot of the producing countries, and that goes through better labor law enforcement, better labor inspection, and enforcement of fundamental principles and rights at work. So that would be an urgent measure as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. Let's hope to have the slow fashion as we had the slow food following the same dynamics. Although I think food was also very much related to health, right? So that was an accelerator and a factor that contributed. Next question is about material innovation, and again, it's 2 minutes each, and I'm going to ask this question to Simone and Abhishek. There is a lot of talk about material innovation, net zero emission production, and yet we continue to see environmental damage and social risk along the fashion value chain. Question to you is, what do we need to achieve change? Simone, over to you. 2 minutes.
Yeah, it's material innovation. We see a lot going around, but I think the fundamental problem is a problem of management. We need a business model that integrates the responsibility to act sustainably with that of realizing effective economic performance. And I think the key element today is performing due diligence on sustainability risks exactly in the same way we perform due diligence on economic and financial risks. Due diligence on sustainability is about identifying and then preventing or at least mitigating sustainability risks for people, for the planet, for society. It's also about the process to enable the remediation of negative impact we may have or we may contribute to on people, environment, and society. I think the real point is to have this management tool in place, a robust ESG, environmental, social governance, due diligence system. This is the key step to ensure that we work towards sustainability. Then all the material innovation, all those things can fit into this. But the first step is a robust ESG due diligence system.
Thank you, Simone. And we cannot say you're not passionate about this. So we are sure also that you are already on this and working with EFI at the proper due diligence system to be used whenever necessary. Abhishek, over to you. From really the from a producer perspective, what do you need to achieve change?
Yeah, thanks, Paula. I think there is indeed change happening, especially we see in last 3 or 4 years. But the pace of change is very slow for the world to take notice still. So the pace needs to be much more accelerated. And I think to everybody in the industry, whether it is government or suppliers or brands or any stakeholders, I would say that we need to all put our money where our mouth is. We need to walk the talk and make the investments which are needed to make the change, because technology is no longer a challenge. We can recycle 100% water. We can install renewable energy to shift away from sort of carbon intensive fuels. We can have more sustainable materials, but the problem is there's not enough investment, and each of us in the supply chain or as a brand, we have our own excuse or shortcomings to be not able to do that. So we need to, the only way to accelerate change is to invest, and unfortunately we don't see that happening at the similar level. We're still buying clothes which are cheaper than what we bought last season. So where would that investment needs to come in, to be honest. So I think the change is happening. There are few players who are willing to take that risk, put in that money, but we don't see it happening more widely because of, I would say, single biggest reason is the investment that are needed to make the change. We have age-old sort of plants and machineries which needs modernization if you have to reduce the environmental impact, and same with the social progress. So as long as we keep paying low for the produce, it will still be the same case. Thanks.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you so much. I'm going to go back now, a question that I'm going to ask to all of you, and you have 1 minute to answer. This is because I think it's relevant to all of you in your capacity and in your jobs. It's about a cultural shift. The consumption culture in many countries is characterized by fast cycles of production and consumption and vast amounts of products, leading to vast amounts of waste. Changing such a system of production towards a more circular, for instance, requires a social cultural shift. So where should we start? And I start from Simone with this question. 1 minute.
Yeah, you're right. We need indeed a cultural shift. The sustainability is a systemic challenge. We need to see things in a perspective of systems thinking, how the different elements of the value chain of fashion get together and how we manage the relationships that shape them. I think that the ultimate challenge is the one of developing a business model that mirrors this approach and that creates value not only for shareholders, but for stakeholders. And when I speak about stakeholders, I mean the workers, I mean communities, I mean the planet. At the end of the day, the debate about sustainability is a debate about the kind of value we create. This is about the transition, and the transition towards a form of stakeholder capitalism.
Thank you, Simone. Oliver, over to you.
Well, it's a big question. Definitely we need a cultural shift, and how to get there is complex. I think one thing is we need to rethink our economic paradigm, and I'm happy to go into that a little bit later. Let me just throw out 2 ideas that it might be more practical and related to the ILO. One is working time. We live in a world where working time is growing and growing, and the disconnect between work and the office, as we all know, during COVID has grown. If we want to have a cultural shift, we need more time for care, for family care, for all the care work we do, and that includes planet care. We need to try to see whether we can actually reduce working time so people have more time to shop ethically, to recycle, and to do all the heavy work that actually living a sustainable lifestyle includes. And that makes it much more accessible also for working people. It's no good if wealthy leisure class people can do this and people who really have to work, perhaps 2 jobs for a living, can't. Secondly, I think we also really need to rethink about income sustainability and social protection for the masses. A lot of the consumption is driven basically by a hoarding instinct. If you are living insecurely, of course, psychologically, you want to amass as much as possible. That's human nature. We need to, if we're asking people to have less and to reduce their lifestyles, they need to have some sort of compensation in terms of free time, time to perhaps boost consumption on other things like culture events or other kinds of service consumption. Thanks, over.
Thank you, Oliver. And I really like this concept of having time for making responsible choice, because it's so much linked and it's so true that you need time to make the right choice. Now over to Abhishek with the same question. Abhishek, over to you.
I would say 2 things. One is, if we take wider view on not only on fashion, but on many such similar goods in the retail industry, the quality has not really improved from what we used to produce 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we are designing as different industries start to design products for obsolescence, whether it is electronics industry or clothing, you have an economic model which disincentivizes you to make high quality products. So that needs to definitely change. And second is more socially equitable distribution of products. So we have a huge chunk of population that doesn't have access to even bare minimum clothing. And on the other hand, we have the problem of waste. So at least in the short to medium term, how to have more equitable distribution of goods.
Thank you, Abhishek. Ursula, social-cultural shift. Over to you.
Well, culturally, I think that the shift that needs to happen is pretty hefty. It doesn't need innovation, but the reality is that we need to treat each other as equals, which humanity I don't think has ever done. So I think that will take a little bit of time. But in the meantime, I would say that we need to really look at where the onus and who has that responsibility. I think clothing longevity is very important in terms of really slowing down this industry. But at the end of the day, sustainable solutions really do need to be accessible and available for all. And I would say that the responsibility for that lays firmly on the fashion brands. I feel that for years we've been trying to tell them, particularly the big mainstream ones, that it absolutely makes business sense to turn to sustainable innovation. I would say that ship has sailed. And I talk more about a moral obligation now for the future.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ursula. Miguel?
Well, I agree completely with what everybody has said. So I think that this shift is very difficult. So it's very difficult in the sense that it requires a lot of time, I would say. I don't think it's that easy to consume less and to think about what you need, because at the end we're talking about less consumption in one sense. I mean, obviously, like I was saying before, there are a lot of innovation, which I think that's going to happen. More recycled materials, we're going to do less CO2, but the big one, which is, okay, can we consume less and better quality products, long lasting, recycle them, repairing them? That's a very big shift. And that's an easy shift to say for someone who is in the Western world, who has already done this journey, and we have traveled so much, and we have had so many cars, and we have had so many clothes. Okay, and how do you explain this to the rest, which have not had that? And I think that's I don't have the solution for that, but I see it's something that we probably need to talk more about this, and maybe less about the technology, because everybody's talking about recycling things, and that's fantastic. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk about this, but that cultural shift is very, very difficult, and hopefully it's going to happen. But obviously, when you have your necessities covered, it's like the Maslow pyramid. At the end, okay, it's easy to say, okay, I don't need to have a lot of things. So I don't know how to do that. So sorry.
Well, thank you, Miguel. And actually, let me just move on now, but just let you know that we are doing well with time. So we definitely will have some time for questions from those that are with us today, all the participants. So feel free to send your questions through the chat, and then we will take them and ask them to our speakers. Now, I have a tricky question for Simone now, if you don't mind. I'm zooming in a little bit now on the UN. So I'm asking him about member states. And I would like to know, Simone, you have 2 minutes for this question. What can member states realistically do to support sustainable practices of the fashion industry? What are the major regulatory gaps of member states? And where are the low-hanging fruits, if there are any?
Mamma mia, that's such a tough question. Thank you, Paola, for asking it to me. Yeah, well, we know all the things, and I'm not going to speak on behalf of the colleagues of ILO and the other colleagues, so legislation about labor, the environment, and all the rest. I'll just focus on one category of low-hanging fruit, which is legislation that puts corporate sustainability reporting at the same level of importance of financial reporting. Over the years, we have perfected reporting and control mechanisms on financials to protect shareholders, to protect suppliers, and so on. We simply need to do the same for sustainability, to protect the planet, to protect all human beings from any kind of abuse related to unsustainable practices. And this is a key point, corporate sustainability reporting, because we all know that environmental and social factors are increasingly material to enterprise value creation. And we know very well that investors now have started asking information on this with the same discipline and rigor they ask about information on financials. So we've got to do it. Corporate sustainability reporting at the same level of financial reporting. This is a low-hanging fruit. This can be done. This is useful.
Well, thank you, Simone. I hope that also member states that were connected today have heard us, and we can really work with them in the future to make sure that at least the low-hanging fruits are going to happen and are going to be actually exploited. Now, I have one last question, and also, of course, we had to ask this question is on the EU Alliance, so we'll ask it to Simone and Oliver, and then we have our concluding questions to all, but then I will have more questions to you that just came in, so I have them in the chat, and just be ready also for additional questions. Simone and Oliver, in a first ever attempt, the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion has mapped out the UN system's response to social environmental problems related to the fashion industry. The main opportunities for coordination and collaboration include advancing circularity, investing in decarbonization, and addressing the impacts of the COVID pandemic. What will the UN do to advance these areas? Should I give it first to Oliver and then to you, Simone? Oliver, go ahead, please.
Well, I think the mapping that you've done is very impressive, and it seems that there are a lot of initiatives in many areas that are going to advance this agenda. And certainly the ILO is doing its part through its Better Work program, which really seeks to improve working conditions in garment factories around the world. It's also about making sure that COVID-19 recovery and transition to sustainable environment is just, and that it doesn't go on the backs of the poor and working people. I would say, though, I think there's a lot more that we can do, and especially in terms of coordination, I think it's very important. One, I would say there's two things. I think we need to start resurrecting some of the discussions from the 70s about the limits of growth and thinking about the economic paradigm that drives a lot of this development thinking that's still prevalent in the United Nations. I know that my organization is still very much wedded to a full employment, full productive employment, productivity increase model of development, which is fair enough. That worked for many hundreds of years, especially in Europe. But unfortunately, it's not sustainable. And we have to think about, are there other ways to develop outside of those models? Is full employment by everyone really something that is sustainable in itself. And I'm sorry, I'm being very heretical here. This is going against the tenets of my organization, but I think it's a legitimate question to ask. The other thing I would simply say is that any efforts that the United Nations does in this regard need to also involve social dialogue and dialogue with many, many stakeholders. It has to involve the workers that are affected. It has to involve the businesses that are going to be affected by these transitions. And I think it also has to, include stakeholders like consumers, because we don't want, that top-down approach where governments simply tell people what to wear. We know that often doesn't go well in societies. So it needs to be something that people really can buy into culturally, psychologically, spiritually, and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you. Simone, if I can ask you a minute instead of 2, so we move forward.
Fair enough.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a lot to do on circularity. Circularity is, Miguel touched about that, and also the other colleagues. It's a hard topic, and there's a lot to do also to understand what exactly to do, and we have a lot of work ahead of us. But I like to touch about the financing the transition to sustainable industry. It's tough, and especially in the global south, it is very tough, because in the global south, the required returns on capital, the cost of capital is very high. And so these investments may be too expensive for producers and people based in the global south. So this calls for a different approach, an approach based on blended finance, where we bring together investment from within those countries, but also from outside, and also putting this investment along with aid, with the right use of public funding, of public resources. So this is a theme on which I think we will work a lot in the near future, how to finance this transition and how to do it in the global south.
Thank you so much, Simone. We get to my last question, and then we move to the many questions that have just came in. I think we still have 15 minutes available for this. So I'll give you only 30 seconds. I'm sorry for this very limited time, but I really want to ask this last question. I want to hear the truth from you, or at least the truth. What is your truth? What do you think about this? Can sustainability in the fashion sector, of course, be achieved within the economic growth logic? Simone, I start from you and I follow the usual sequence.
If economic growth is managed within its framework and interactions with environmental and social issues, we can do it. But economic growth alone is a very bad guide. It's like navigating the oceans on the basis of longitude while ignoring latitude. You go nowhere, or you don't reach your destination.
Thank you. Oliver?
I think so. If we have more time to shop for ethical brands, if we have time to enjoy perhaps services that they provide, like repair or even cultural services that might be associated with smaller fashion houses, I think we can have a new model. I take the beer example again as an inspiration.
Thank you, Oliver. And I really like that you introduced this issue of time in the sustainable fashion discussion. It's quite relevant. Abhishek.
Yeah, for me, the key issue is the appropriate pricing of natural resources and social resources as well. So as long as we continue to have free water, or no price to air pollution, or no price to carbon emissions, we would have that economic dilemma. But as soon as we price these appropriately, these are all automatically factored into the costs and economic model.
Thank you. Ursula, what do you think?
This level of growth, no, not unless this level of growth is redistributed throughout the supply chain. The industry right now denies the existence of the equivalent of what Oliver is talking about, which is the small brewer. In fact, we have the opposite. We have an absolute, we're inundated with the same from every single high street. So no, I don't see it happening if we keep thinking this way. If we look historically and imagine the dinosaurs were taken over by mammals at some point in our past, and we think of something similar happening again, and therefore a just redistribution of those profits to invest in the supply chain and the people who make those products, then yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ursula. Miguel.
Well, I think it is possible, and I think we should fight for it. I think it's our obligation as a generation, which we are seeing what is happening, that we should fight for it. And the two main questions is, first of all, economically, how do we do this transition? Is that possible or not? And if we do it, okay, how do we do it? Because that's not just about the fashion industry, it's about the whole growth of the economy. Same with electronics, it's the same with travel, it's the same with everything. So if we solve fashion and we don't solve the rest, nothing's going to happen. So one thing, what do we do with that, with this transition? And the other is, what do we do with the jobs if we really lose them? I mean, I think that's something that Oliver was talking about. It's about purpose of the people. We talk about the purpose of organizations, but we need to talk about the purpose of the people. It's not just about money. And jobs have been a big part of the purpose of the people during the past century. So we also need to face that. But I think we should, and we should fight for it.
Thank you, Miguel. Now let's move into the questions and answers. I have to apologize. I have to read from my cell phone. I have the first question, and these are also hard questions. I've been reading a few, and it's for all of you. So I give you 30 seconds, so we make sure that we will be able to address also the others. The first question is from Emis Dobos, a PhD student from Hungary. The question is as follows: as fashion industry grows faster than it could be more green, and several commitments from companies towards sustainability are voluntary, and even if there are national regulations of labor rights, but these are not enforced, how do you see the feasibility of legal regulation of the fashion industry towards being more sustainable? Sorry. I hope it was clear. I can read it again, but let me start now from Miguel. I go backwards this time. 30 seconds for this question.
The fast answer is yes. I mean, it would be great to have more legislation, more global legislation on this issue, so that we don't have individual legislations all over the place, and that it's very difficult sometimes to follow. I think we saw a good example on corporate tax last week. Why don't we find something similar to that on sustainability all over the world? So yes, that will help.
Ursula, over to you.
Well, first of all, I say, please check the Fashion Transparency Index. It publishes today, and it gives you a really good indication of what brands say and don't say about their supply chain. Our Fashion Transparency Index is really about public disclosure. And secondly, of course, I couldn't agree more. I mean, the fashion industry, despite sharing many similarities with other industries, such as food and beauty, is not regulated. So there is no obligation when it comes to the brands to let us know what's in our clothes or who made them and in what conditions. And of course, 100% this needs to change.
Thank you, Ursula. Abhishek.
I would agree. More legislation would help, especially which is applicable to broader geographies, because even in the production world, there are countries with varying degrees of regulation. And in the past, we have seen the production shifting from one country to another to avoid certain regulation or cost of increasing or meeting the increasing regulations. So that should not happen.
Oliver, over to you.
Yeah, I fully agree. I would just add that, international coordination on legislation is important, because you don't want to race to the bottom. As Abhishek said, you don't want, simply to transfer the problem to countries where the legislation doesn't exist. So international standards on this would be important as well.
Simone.
Sorry, I was muted. No, absolutely, I agree. Thanks God, we see something coming up on that in the area of corporate sustainability reporting. For instance, the European Commission is moving towards a new directive on corporate sustainability reporting, which is exactly about that. We need, as my colleagues said before, international coordination to avoid the race to the bottom, but we also need a principle, which is, for instance, in some kind of legislation also related to fashion in the UK, the principle that wherever you work, the legislation that applies on human rights and on the environment is the one prevailing in your country and not in the place where you produce. But all this is a bit moving, and we have to see what is lacking, what is missing. But I think we need also to look at what is coming up, this collective effort, the US, the UK, Germany, the European Commission, and so on.
Thank you, Simone. Now, I had another question on legislation from Anissa Johnny, but I think we have addressed the issue of regulation. Let me move on to something else. This is a very interesting question, and I really would like to ask this to Oliver and Abhishek. It's actually addressed from Radha Bishbakarma to Oliver and Abhishek. People have been exploited. Modern day slavery is happening in Bangladesh, India, and many global South countries. It is similar to history of slavery related to cotton. This cannot happen again. We cannot wait anymore for bureaucratic conversations, but more strategic human nature design plans that are also safeguard jobs and people who are in the supply chain are paid fairly. So that they are part of the solution and not put as part of the problem. In the relation of caring for the environment, in relation to caring for the environment, we cannot dismiss the artisans and workers' lives as well. How will or has ILO addressed this in policy? And I guess this is from Oliver, and also Abhishek, if you can reply to this. Quickly, please, 30 seconds, so we have time for another very interesting question to follow.
Well, thanks. Of course, this is a big issue that the ILO has worked on for a long time. The ILO has very important international labor conventions dealing with child labor and forced labor, which have been ratified by the countries that were mentioned in the question. There are very strong supervisory mechanisms that now work with countries to try to apply those conventions. Of course, there are still gaps. It's a question of political will. How will countries develop legislation that actually puts these conventions into place and then actually implement them, have the labor inspection necessary, the police inspection necessary to enforce them? That is still something that needs to be worked on, but it is, something of utmost priority for the ILO. And I fully agree with the question. The workers that are involved are not part of the problem. They hopefully will be part of the solution, and we have to find ways to empower them to be so. Thanks.
Thank you. Abhishek, over to you.
I think as a supplier, the workers are our own full-time permanent employees, and as any employer, we would like to sort of pay fair wages as well as want a happy workforce which can deliver. But the problem with the sort of audits and standards has been that they've always worked at a minimum. So you define minimum wage, you define minimum standard, and sort of that becomes a benchmark. So instead of something to strive for as a sort of ambitious goal, you're striving to meet the lowest denominator. So that is a key issue, and I think transparency there would help. Looking at wages based on cost of living would help. Regional minimum wages would help, which are more wider than the state level or country level wages, and would be happy to drive that as part of the industry.
Thank you, Abhishek. I think we have time at least for another question. This question came in but was not addressed to anybody in particular. So I would like to ask this question to Miguel and Ursula. How exactly do fashion brands respond to telling them they have a moral obligation? For instance, this was the first line from the LVMH's most recent sales report. LVMH recorded revenue of 14 billion euros for the first quarter of 2021, up 32% compared to the same period in 2020, and up 30% on an organic basis. How do you realistically move brands and companies' focus away from revenues and profits? Ursula, and then Miguel, from your perspective. You're muted.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, no
they
problem.
don't react very well when we say things, and never have at all. That's why I've been saying things for the last 25 years. But I promise you things change. Some of the more utopistic things I was saying 20 years ago are now quite common and quite debated. And so there is hope. Hope is not with the management as it is right now. Hope is with the management that will come later. Hope is with those young designers or students that are now still in college or just out, and who will take the reins of those brands. You know, we are looking at a spectacular change in terms of attitudes for younger people, and kids nowadays that have lived through COVID are going to be teenagers soon. They're going to be adults very soon. You know, life is long, but time moves fast. And the younger generation is aware of the urgency. These brands are not going to look the same in 10 years at all.
Well, thank you, Ursula, for that. Miguel, you can really speak right as a CEO of a quite well-known brand. So what is your view on that?
Well, I don't have that growth, so in a way.
Exactly.
But I would say that I think Ursula is right. I think the new generation obviously is very, very committed to that. I think there's a strong push from consumers, from our kids, from everybody which is coming into the industry. And I think that there has been a lot, even if there is growth. And I think this goes back to the previous question of how this question of the 70s that Oliver was saying, and I think he's right. Is it sustainable to keep growing like this? I think this is the biggest question. But I think in a way, I think we have moved a lot, and a lot of the things that sound completely crazy 20 years ago, 15 years ago, 10 years ago even, I think today that you see them also in these reports, which before you didn't even have anything. Maybe it's not the first sentence, maybe it's after that sentence, maybe it comes afterwards. So I wouldn't, because I think an obligation as a CEO, I have to say that we have an obligation to earn money. And I think that this is something which also people need to understand, obviously, because otherwise you have no investment and you cannot pay your salaries and that's not sustainable. I'm a member of the 4th generation of my family. So we have been in Inca in my area for so many years. And I think that this is something which is also responsibility and that responsibility to earn money. I don't know if it's the first one, but for sure it's as important as the other one, because otherwise you don't have anything. Well, I mean, obviously, as I said, I think the change is coming. I agree 100%, and it's much better today. Is it enough, the speed of change? That's probably the big question.
Thank you, Miguel. And look, we have still a few questions, but we are run out of time. So let's just mention that there is Jackal Betty, Oronse Onkupunu, Michael Stanley Jones is a colleague and one of the founders actually of the Alliance, and Elmar Strumer. They were all asking other questions, which unfortunately I'm really sorry, but we cannot address now. We'll come back to you separately. I don't want to miss the next speaker, and it's really for me an honor and a pleasure to introduce the person that will, out of these many hard questions, will give us some hope and direction, and really come with some concluding remarks that possibly will help us figure out what to do next, because there is so much to do, but we heard in so many directions, in so many areas, and at different speed as well. So it is my pleasure to introduce now Ms. Ligia Noronha, UN Assistant Secretary General and head of the UNEP office in New York. As I mentioned, Ligia, also a bit of background of the other speakers. Let me also mention that you are an economist with over 30 years of international professional experience in promoting environmental sustainability. You had different positions in UNEP as Director of the Environment Program, Division of Technology, Industry and Economics. You were Lead Director of 2 of the 7 UN Environment Sub-Programs, the Chemicals and Waste and Resource Efficiency. And you lead the emerging agenda on environment and pollution and health, and much more. I don't want to take time away from you, however, and I really leave you with this hard task, probably the hardest task of the day, and to provide us with some thoughts and conclusions and really take us to the end of this rather interesting event, I believe. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Paula. This was an absolutely fascinating event, and not only because of your great moderation, which kept everyone to time, but because of the really, really hard talk and hard messages that we got. And I found it incredibly rejuvenating and incredibly important to the whole discussion around sustainable consumption and production, focusing on one of the high impact sectors, which is fashion. So thank you so very much to the panelists, because this is a great way for us to really, what shall I say, enhance and raise the gear on this whole industry. So thank you. And thank you for all of those who put this event together, especially hosted by the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. Thank you, therefore, to the organizers, and for all of you who are connected to this event for being part of this. The event has indeed highlighted how fashion can and has to be a key player in achieving the SDGs, which we are discussing in the HLPF, especially SDG 8 on decent work and economy, but SDG 12 on responsible consumption and production. And Paula, one of the things that is not in my CV is that I'm passionate about sustainable consumption and production. That's what I've been leading in for the last few years, which is something which is why I'm so excited about this panel. But I'm going to put away my nice speech and get on with summarizing what you've said, because I've been so excited by what you've said. And I'm actually going to follow the way you've structured it, because I think that's a nice way of talking about what we've come out with today. And first, let me start with understanding of sustainable fashion. It was great that you all spoke to responsibility, to moral obligation, and the long-term view. That's exactly right. In today's very, very difficult world, with the crisis, with the looming crises of the planet, climate, and everything else that we have, the biodiversity losses, absolutely taking the long view is so important. Focusing on people over profits, absolutely key. And if we want to change the economic and finance system that we have, we need both the long view and we need this understanding that people matter more than profits. So yes, we need to make money, Miguel, but we need to make it sustainably, as you've been saying, responsibly, as you've been saying again and again, which is incredibly important. Looking at net positive impacts. So reducing environmental impact, but having a much greater social impact is what we're talking about. Dignity and respect for the work. I just love that. And a focus on equitable distribution of the profits across the value chain, but also distribution of goods in terms of the waste and underconsumption. And this is an important point that you raised, which I like to emphasize in the context of developed and developing countries, because sustainable consumption is not just about overconsumption. Sustainable consumption is about underconsumption. There are people who have not had the same opportunities and the same, what shall I say, chances to have these things that others have had. They may not be important to a good life, but it's an aspiration. And therefore, what we need to focus on, I think, is looking at aspirational consumerism or aspirational consumption in a different way. And what you've done today is really speak to that aspirational consumption, which the younger generation is really all set to move towards and are really our hope for the future. And then you spoke of business models. And in this, you've spoken about the need to pay more, consume responsibility, improve the quality of life of workers. Workers has been an important element in all of your comments. Slow fashion across the value chain. Due diligence, I thought that was important on sustainability, risks, and remediation. Robust ESG and ethics, and investments in the supply chain to accelerate material innovations. Indeed, we can keep talking about everything we have, but if we don't create the enabling policies and the enabling investments and enabling infrastructure, we will not create that change, because even if we want to change, everything around us is not changing, and therefore it becomes difficult for us to do that. The cultural shift was a really, really important discussion. And Ursula spoke to the fashion brands that need to be much more responsible, need to have a much greater moral obligation and responsibility for the future. So how do we work with not just the fashion brands, but also the advertising companies who put it out there and create the changes in our mind? We don't want things, but we get them. And I just moved to New York, and I'm absolutely inundated with email messages on to buy more, to consume more. And there is this heavy pressure to consume more. So what do we do to address that? What do we do about packaging, which is not exactly fashion, but comes with all the other things that we speak about? the kind of value we create for all stakeholders. You know, if we really are going to focus on the key impact sectors, and fashion is one of them, and we want to focus on the value chains, we need to then pick up on how do we work on those drivers and barriers across the value chain, but also the actors who are going to make that difference. And therefore, this is what you've been saying is very important. Oliver, fascinating point on time to make responsible choices. I love that. And reminded me of that film, Shopaholic, isn't it? Shopaholic, whatever, I forget now. But also responsibility to the other and the choices available to the other. That is so important. How do we think about the other? How do we empathize with the other? How do we take the other into our thinking? Then the question of what can member states and UN do? Work to rebalancing growth and development. That's what I heard from you. Revisit the mantra of full employment. Very good, excellent. What does that mean? How do we deconstruct that? How do we do the dialogue with stakeholders to get their buy-in for the required change for the just transition that we talk about? What exactly do we mean? ILO has come up with a great definition of just transition, but on the ground, how does that translate better? I think we need to come up with some language which is even more easy to articulate and share. Innovative financing of the transaction, especially in the global south, sustainability disclosures, harmonizing of regulations, and avoiding the race to the bottom. How important. And Paula, the question on can sustainability in the fashion industry coexist with the current economic paradigm? And, you know, I thought you'd be stronger on that one because of the kind of messaging I got right through. But somehow, and I'm giving you honest feedback, although you were very strong all over, when it came to this, you spoke more about, I think, tinkering at the edges rather than saying you need to move from linear to circular. You need to move to much more responsible. You did talk about ethical brands and cultural and repair services. That's great. And address mispricing, reimagining a just redistribution. But maybe you need to say we need a different economic system, not just say that we need to play around with these things because it doesn't work. And you certainly spoke of the younger generation, which is on the move and stronger push from these millennials, which is really going to make this change. So this has been really good, but I would be remiss if I also don't talk about the UN Alliance for Sustainable Fashion, which is the host today and is well suited to support member states and other value chain actors to address some of the problems and solutions that you discussed today. So, you know, please do join the Alliance, those of you who are not part of the Alliance, because only through a collective approach across multiple UN agencies and stakeholders can we help countries progress in the transformation of this sector and to take this forward. From the initial idea of an alliance at the HLPF 3 years ago and its official launch at UNEA 4 in 2019, the UN Alliance has grown and come a long way. This event really proves how much it's moved forward. This work will culminate in the creation of a knowledge base later this year to further improve coordination between UN bodies, and I would strongly look forward to that. In conclusion, Paula, let me remind us that we have heard today, we have the knowledge and solutions at hand. We have the measures necessary to achieve the transformation of the system. In UNEP, we are taking this knowledge forward, but we will also develop roadmaps of concrete actions to promote circularity where we can, but much greater responsibility in the textile value chain. So we are completely in sync with you, and I'm very happy to have been part of this event today. And I thank you very much for inviting me. Over to you, Paula.
Well, honestly, Lydia, I believe we just found another member of our alliance today. And actually, next year, we might count on you to be physically in New York and organize another hard talk, possibly with speakers that will be present in the UN. As I mentioned, we try to always bring the issue of sustainable fashion within the HLPF discussions, because as you correctly mentioned, sustainable fashion is linked to so many of the SDGs, and you cannot really find more connections and with this sector. So no matter what the focus of the HLPF would be, we will always have something to say. So we count on you next year to be our focal point there, and certainly we will make sure that you're always informed of our activities, so you can also participate and come in. We have, you see, an ambassador here in Geneva that opened the meeting, and now we count on you to be our ambassador in New York. It's, you know, being over the territory and well placed is also a key feature of the UN Alliance. Before closing, as we still have a few minutes, I would like to give a last chance, because, you know, our speakers are also advocates. I'm thinking about Ursula, and Ursula, by the way, it's been my pleasure to meet you, because I always follow your posts, and, you know, and so like having you now there real is a great opportunity. So I would like to have to give the floor back to you, just for a sort of 1-minute message that really comes up from your heart and from your experience, and leaving us what is next, where should we go, what will you do, and really a message. We have heard a lot, perhaps we'll go back to the old you know, the old habits, nothing has changed, but I believe the pandemic shook us a bit. So perhaps a message of hope of what is next for sustainable fashion. I'll start from the bottom, and we end with Simone. So Miguel, over to you.
Sorry, I start? You said, sorry, Paula?
I start from you with your message.
Okay,
you have
perfect.
1 minute for your message.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I think the message is let's try to be critical. Let's try to measure things. Let's try to improve little by little. If you can make big changes by making very small changes in our daily lives. So I think that's extremely relevant for all of us. And let's be critical. I think that's the other thing that is very critical. I mean, nobody's perfect. So there are things that we have to change. And the other thing is don't buy things that you don't need. So I think try to repair, try to make things which last, and that's probably a good way of moving into a more sustainable world in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Ursula. Over to you, leaders.
Am I muted now? I would say don't be afraid to start from your own wardrobe, and don't necessarily think that small actions won't bring on a huge collective. Everything you do, if you do it with purpose and joyfully, will attract others to follow you. This is how movements are made. This is how trends are made. So for me, start with what you have. Ask yourself a lot of questions. And don't take information like we take fast fashion, i.e. it's there, it's mine. It does require time, and it does require knowledge. I'm asked so many times, what do I think of brands when they greenwash? And my reply, it's always that my opinion doesn't matter anywhere near as much as you developing yours. And I think that this is important. We come from a generation where a lot of the wisdoms we had on treating clothes, understanding clothes, turning clothes the other way around to see how it's made has been lost. Get it back.
Thank you, Ursula. Abhishek.
I think, Paula, what I've learned in my tenure in the industry, and especially during last few years, is that there is a lot of hope now. There's hope that there are technologies which are emerging, which can really dramatically shift the way we produce. And of course, I cannot say so about consumption, but at least from the production side, there's a possibility to produce the same goods with a drastically lower environmental impact, and also, of course, create more positive social impact. So all that we need is will to do so, a more longer term view on the businesses, both by brands and suppliers, and also investment. So and if we have these things, I think we can make a drastic progress from where we all are.
Thank you very much, Abhishek. Oliver.
Thank you. Well, listen, I was very inspired to hear some of the employers on this panel. To hear a CEO of a clothing company say, buy less, let's think about limits to growth. This is really inspiring because it shows that we don't have to be afraid. Technological and consumer shifts and transitions are as old as economic history. And it's always scary for people who are deeply invested in it right now. but it is possible. I don't think we have to destroy jobs. I don't think we have to necessarily reduce consumption. It will inevitably lead to a reduction of consumption of things, but it might be that we can shift this to other less environmentally impactful services or cultural events and so forth. And I think if we can make that transition just, we don't have to be afraid. So my message is, don't be afraid.
Thank you, Oliver. I'm going to give the floor to Simone, our chairperson, leading the Alliance in many, many events. And we are going to then stop a bit earlier, as also we have to now give space to the actual high-level political forum that will start this session. And as I see that people are starting to leave us, most probably to join the other, the real HLPA session. But Simone, I wanted your last word as chairperson of the UN Alliance. What is the message that you're leaving us, and with one message should we leave this meeting?
Yeah, you know, the fashion supply chain, the fashion value chain spans across the global south, and it has an incredible power to regenerate not only the environmental capital, but also the social capital of the world in which we live. We work in places of war, of conflict, where we produce in Afghanistan, in Mali, and we see how powerful is just putting people at work together with a shared purpose, with a shared objective. It's engaging for sustainable fashion, is also engaging for a better, more sustainable and more peaceful world. It's engaging for a better world, and it's possible. I remember when we started the Ethical Fashion Initiative, I was in London and I met Ursula. And Ursula in those days was starting Aesthetica and Fashion Revolution. And together we were dreaming about this one day. And then today, look at Ursula. She's at the head of a huge advocacy scheme, which is extremely successful. And we manage a huge supply chain that spans across the global south, investing in people, investing in sustainability. It's possible. Just get engaged. Be part of it.
And thank you very much. I see Ursula nodding and everybody else. And with this, I'll thank you all for your participation, for your engagement, for a fantastic hard talk. And honestly, I hope to see you in person next time, although it's been a pleasure to meet you virtually, but hopefully we will have another similar meeting next year in the margin of the HLPF, perhaps in person in New York. And over to you, and goodbye. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.